I was a huge Ratchet and Clank fan during the PS2 generation. They had great platforming and weapons and was one of the few games to truly make me laugh. One of my biggest regrets is that I missed Deadlock when it first came out. I read all the previews, played the demo, but I was still a kid so couldn't really afford it at the time. However, when it came to PlayStation Network, I knew it was a perfect excuse to go back and catch up on the one game I missed all those years ago. Needless to say, I was disappointed. Not because it's a bad game, but it could have been so much better. It improves a lot on the first 3 games, but also gets a lot wrong.
The new armor you're wearing is standard issue for new contestants.
Contestants?
Ratchet has never had the strongest stories. This one is just so bare bones and flat. The initial premise of Ratchet being captured and forced to fight in the Gladiator Fight Club seems awesome at first, but really it goes nowhere. It hits all the beats you would expect, but really it's just a thin excuse as to why you're in a different level. They try and add a twist late in the game, but again, there are only about 4 cutscenes in the game, so it really doesn't have a lot of emotional weight and it's just there for shock value. While I wasn't expecting a full, deep story, I definitely expected more than a simple go here, shoot this, now go here, and repeat. The Ratchet & Clank games have always been bright and colorful, and while this game is no different, they take a slightly darker turn with it. There are still a bunch of colors, but they're a lot more diluted and faded to match the bleak and dreary tone of being forced to fight for your life. Enemies are generic robots, ranging from big to small, but they all have their own charm. That is until the game simply palette swaps a lot of the enemies later on in the game. The weapons are also rather simple and unoriginal. The past games were known for the wacky, crazy weapons that could do all sorts of different things. All of the weapons in this game are generic things like pistols, shotguns, rockets, or rip-offs of past weapons. The only thing that makes them stand out is that each weapon can be modded to have different effects like lava or mini-bombs. Visually, when you have 5 or 6 mods going on, it's pure chaos and things look just insane. Unfortunately, this also affects gameplay because the more items you have on screen, the more of a significant amount of slowdown you experience. It only lasts a minute or 2, but it's enough for you to keep noticing. This would be bad in any other game, but for a Ratchet game to make the player not want to use big explosive weapons simply because of slowdown is a huge drawback. Beyond that, sound-wise and graphically, it's a very plain game. Levels feel like rip-offs from past games, and in one instance they even rip off Star Wars. And while everything sounds as it should, with the limited arsenal, there are no silly or weird sounds. Overall, this game does what it needs to, but doesn't go beyond the bare minimum, and in the case of the slowdown, doesn't even measure up. If there is one enjoyable part of this game, it's the combat. It doesn't do much to reinvent the wheel, but that's because it's already so buttery smooth. They do lock the camera behind you when you aim, so you don't have to strafe and simply move in whatever direction you want. The biggest addition is 2 robotic allies who help you with missions, fighting off enemies, and hacking items for you. Ultimately, I was never so overwhelmed that I would be lost without them, but they were still a nice addition. The only real complaint I have with this game is there are no puzzles or platforming or side missions whatsoever. Now, this is why it's simply called Ratchet, because it was built to be a non-stop action game. However, this means most missions are simply kill an enemy until the time or the limit is filled. There are 1 or 2 races and target practices, but they are too few and far between. If you dislike the platforming from past games, then this is heaven sent. But having a game that is just shooting gets really old after a while. From a strictly reviewing standpoint, it's a great fun game, and if you've never played a Ratchet game before, it's a great place to start. However, there are a ton of small annoyances that will affect anyone who has played a Ratchet game before. One issue is the way they handle skill points. In past games, they required skill or for players to go out of their way to achieve them. In this game, there are 165 total, so a lot of them repeat, and most of them are just variants of killing a certain amount of enemies with a certain gun. They don't feel special, it's just a checklist of something to do while you play the game. There's also an issue with the descriptions themselves, which ask you to kill a certain type of enemy, but there is no in-game encyclopedia or way to see which enemy is what, which forced me to go online for help simply to find out. The overabundance of them and the lack of originality really lessens the impact they have on the game. The weapons also lack any real sense of impact. All the weapons in this game are rather generic. The only thing that makes them stand out is that each weapon can be modded to have different effects like lava or mini-bombs. There's also no sense of progression like there was in the past games. The starter pistol and the fully maxed one feel and control the exact same and have no visual differences, be it ammo or the weapons themselves. The leveling is also extremely off balance. Like past games, during your first playthrough you max out at level 10, and after starting challenge mode, you can buy an Omega weapon to level it up further. However, compared to past games, these weapons max out at level 99, which means 89 of those levels you gain is in challenge mode. With so many levels, they upgrade super fast. While this sounds good, whenever a weapon upgrades, it gets ammo refilled, which means often you will just use a weapon till it upgrades to refill it instead of buying ammo. This leads to you having an insane amount of money in your pocket, and you can afford the super weapon very early on in the game, which also lessens its impact. Overall, that's the best way to describe this game. It is a really fun Ratchet game that has its impact lessened by a bunch of small annoyances.
Then it's time to turn that dial to something a little more dangerous. Time for some real action. It's time to blow up! That's right, it's time for Dreadzone!
The biggest issue with Ratchet Deadlock has nothing to do with the game itself, but its timing. This is simply an expansion pack, or DLC. However, because it was released on the PlayStation 2, it had to be packed into a full disc, even though ultimately it's not a full game. To beat the story mode once only takes about 5 or 6 hours. As DLC, I would be a lot more lenient, but as a full game, it's far too short, far too simple to expect anyone to pay full price. Luckily, it's been bundled in the Ratchet collection and is on the PlayStation Network, often for very cheap prices. As much as I may have bitched and whined, I never overtly hated the game and always enjoyed myself. Just, for anyone who is a die-hard Ratchet fan, they need to know, it's not a bad game, but it's not one of Ratchet's best.